I was 68 when Charlie and I first laid eyes on the Whitmore mansion, its Victorian bones jutting against the October sky like something out of a fever dream. My old golden retriever pressed close to my leg as we stood at the rusted gate, his amber eyes fixed on the third-floor windows where shadows moved without wind. The auctioneer's voice carried across the crowd of maybe 20 souls brave enough to venture out to Millfield County for what most folks called another one of those estate disasters. But Charlie's tail wasn't wagging like it usually did at gatherings. Instead, he whined low in his throat, a sound I'd learned to trust after 15 years of partnership. The mansion had been empty since 1978, when old Henrik Whitmore died without heirs, or so the county records claimed. 3 stories of Queen Anne architecture, wraparound porches sagging under decades of weather, and windows so thick with grime they looked like dead eyes. Paint peeled from the clappered siding in long strips that curled and twisted in the autumn wind, and the copper gutters had turned that particular shade of green that speaks of decades without maintenance. The roof showed patches where shingles had blown away, leaving dark wounds in the slate that would let winter rain seep into the bones of the house. But underneath all that neglect, I could see the quality of the original construction, the massive corner posts, the intricate gingerbread trim that had been hand-carved by craftsmen who took pride in their work, the solid foundation stones that had weathered nearly a century and a half without shifting. The bidding started at $5,000 for the house and its 43 acres of overgrown farmland. I watched contractors shake their heads and walk away, investors scribble numbers and cross them out, dreamers take photos and whisper about the impossibility of restoration. The property stretched from the country road back into rolling hills covered with oak and maple, land that had once been productive farmland, but now grew wild with sumac and brambles. An old barn leaned precariously near the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, and what remained of fence lines disappeared into thickets that hadn't been cleared in decades. When I raised my paddle at 22,000, the murmur that rippled through the crowd carried more pity than surprise. "Crazy old fool," someone behind me muttered. "That place has been picked clean by vandals and time." The woman next to me, a local real estate agent I recognized from town, leaned over with genuine concern in her voice. "Mr. Henderson, you sure about this? That house is going to eat money like a hungry dog eats scraps. Foundation problems, electrical that's probably older than you are, plumbing that was questionable 40 years ago, not to mention whatever critters have made themselves at home in there." But I'd spent 43 years as a mechanical engineer before retirement, and these old bones still knew good structure when they saw it. More than that, I'd learned to listen to Charlie's instincts. My golden retriever had been my constant companion since my wife Ellen passed 7 years earlier, and in that time, I'd watched him sense things that escaped human perception. He'd warned me about the gas leak in my own kitchen 2 months before the utility company's detector found it. He'd refused to let me take our usual walking path through Miller's Woods the day before the county discovered that old well with the rotted cover. Charlie didn't just see or smell things differently than I did. He seemed to feel the world in ways that my engineer's mind couldn't quantify, but had learned to respect. As we walked through the mansion that first day, keys heavy in my palm, he moved with purpose through rooms that should have been foreign to him. The realtor had given me a ring with maybe 15 keys on it, none of them labeled, and warned me that some of the doors might be warped shut from decades of humidity and neglect. But Charlie seemed to know exactly where he wanted to go. His nose worked constantly, and twice he stopped at walls where nothing seemed different to my human eyes, pouring gently at baseboards and whining that same low note. The house smelled of decades. Must and mouse droppings, yes, but underneath something else. Something that made Charlie's hackles rise and my own skin prickle with recognition I couldn't name. The front hall rose 2 stories, with a staircase that curved gracefully to the 2nd floor. The newel post was carved from what looked like cherry wood, dark with age but still solid under my touch. Wallpaper hung in long strips, revealing patches of horsehair plaster underneath that showed the house's age. The floors were wide plank pine, scarred by decades of use but still sound. Each room we entered told a story of abandonment, furniture covered in sheets that had turned grey with dust, windows so dirty they filtered the daylight into something weak and yellow, radiators that hadn't felt steam heat in decades. But it was in what must have been Henrik's study that Charlie's behavior changed most dramatically. The room faced east, with 2 tall windows that would have caught the morning light when they weren't clouded with grime. Built-in bookcases lined 3 walls, their shelves mostly empty except for a few volumes that had been deemed worthless by whoever had cleared out the house. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its leather top cracked and curled at the edges. Charlie walked straight to the far corner of the room and began pawing at the floor with an intensity I'd never seen before. He whined and looked back at me, then returned to his pawing, his claws clicking against the pine boards. I'd grown up in houses like this one, back when my grandmother's farm in Nebraska still had rooms that weren't heated and cellars that held more than just preserves. My father taught me that old buildings keep secrets, that walls remember voices, and floors hold the weight of footsteps long after the walkers are gone. He'd been a carpenter before the Depression took everything, a craftsman who understood wood and stone and the way buildings settle into their foundations over time. He raised me to see what others missed, the way hand-hewn beams told stories of the men who shaped them, how door frames settled over decades to accommodate the earth's shifting moods, why some floors creaked and others stayed silent under the weight of years. Listen to the house, he used to tell me when we'd worked together on repair projects during my childhood summers. Every sound means something. Every crack has a story. The trick is learning to separate the important messages from the background noise. He taught me to run my hands along walls, to feel for irregularities, to tap on wood to hear the difference between solid construction and hollow spaces, to look for the subtle signs that indicated hidden features or structural problems. Those lessons had served me well during my engineering career, but I'd never expected to need them in quite this way. When Charlie and I found that first loose floorboard in what must have been Henrik's study, my father's lessons came flooding back like muscle memory. The board was maybe 8 inches wide and perhaps 3 feet long, part of the original flooring, but somehow different from its neighbors. When I knelt beside Charlie and ran my fingers along its edges, I could feel that it wasn't nailed down like the others. Instead, it seemed to rest in place, held by nothing more than gravity and the pressure of the surrounding boards. Charlie's excitement was palpable. His tail wagged furiously as I worked my fingers under one edge, and he pressed his nose close to the gap as it widened. The floorboard gave way under my crowbar with barely a whisper, revealing a space that shouldn't have existed according to the house's blueprints. The cavity was maybe 2 feet square and perhaps 18 inches deep, lined with what looked like cedar planking to protect against moisture and insects. Charlie's entire body went rigid as the scent rose up from below. Not the expected mustiness of hidden spaces, but something sharper, more complex, something that made him back away with his ears flat against his skull and a growl rumbling deep in his chest. My flashlight beam caught the edge of what looked like a metal strongbox, maybe 18 inches square and 6 inches deep, wrapped in oiled leather that had kept the elements at bay for God knew how long. The strongbox was heavier than I'd expected when I lifted it out. Not heavy like gold or silver, but substantial in the way that important things often are. The leather wrapping was supple despite its age, clearly maintained with regular applications of oil that had kept it flexible and waterproof. Underneath the leather, the strongbox itself was made of steel, with a lock that looked complex enough to deter casual thieves, but not so sophisticated that it would resist a determined effort. The metal showed no signs of rust or corrosion, suggesting that Henrik's preservation methods had been thorough and effective. Inside, beneath more oiled leather and what looked like cedar shavings that still held their aromatic properties after decades, I found a collection that would have made any historian weep. Photographs, dozens of them, some dating back to the 1890s, according to the careful notations on their backs written in a precise hand, with fountain pen ink that had faded to brown but remained legible. But these weren't family portraits or vacation snapshots. These were documentation, evidence gathered with the methodical care of someone who understood the importance of proof. Pictures of men in expensive suits shaking hands with others in working clothes, money changing hands in what looked like carefully staged transactions, signatures being witnessed on documents that were photographed close enough to read. The photographs told a story that unfolded chronologically as I sorted through them by date. Henrik Whitmore hadn't been just a lumber mill owner. He'd been a careful observer of his business partner's activities, someone who'd noticed patterns and inconsistencies that others had either missed or chosen to ignore. The early photographs showed normal business activities, timber contracts being signed, workers being paid, lumber being loaded onto railroad cars for shipment. But gradually, the images began to document something else entirely. Late-night meetings in locations that had nothing to do with the lumber business. Money being counted and divided in ways that suggested profits far beyond what a small-town mill could generate. Handshakes between Henrik's business partners and men whose faces I didn't recognize, but whose expensive clothes and confident bearing suggested they weren't from our rural county. And beneath the photographs, wrapped in silk that had somehow kept its burgundy color despite the decades, were documents that made my hands shake as I read them by the dusty afternoon light streaming through the study windows. Bank records showing deposits and withdrawals that didn't match the mill's official books. Contracts written in careful legal language that established shell companies and dummy corporations. Letters exchanged between Henrik's partners and individuals in Chicago, Kansas City, and St. Louis, discussing shipments that clearly had nothing to do with lumber. Most damning of all, a detailed ledger in Henrik's own handwriting that tracked money flowing through his mill from what he'd identified as illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, and what the documents delicately referred to as protection services. Henrik Whitmore hadn't died without heirs, and he certainly hadn't died of natural causes. He'd died protecting the evidence that would have brought down a criminal organization that used his legitimate lumber business to launder money from illegal activities across the Midwest. The papers told a story that the county officials had either buried or never bothered to investigate. A story of a man who'd discovered that his business partners were using his lumber mill as the centerpiece of an operation that stretched from Chicago to Kansas City. Henrik had started documenting everything once he realized what was happening, building a case with the meticulous care of someone who understood that half measures would mean death. The photographs showed Henrik documenting everything, but they also showed something else that chilled my blood. In several of the later images, Henrik himself appeared, but always in the background, always partially hidden, always with the look of a man who knew he was being watched. His face in those photographs showed the strain of living with dangerous knowledge, the weight of understanding that he was surrounded by people who would kill him without hesitation if they discovered what he was doing. But Henrik had been smarter and more determined than they'd given him credit for. Every document in that strongbox was a copy. The originals, according to a hand-drawn map tucked between photographs, were hidden somewhere else on the property. But Henrik had disappeared before he could present his evidence, and his death had been a convenient fiction that allowed certain parties to claim his property through legal maneuvering that looked legitimate on the surface, but was actually an elaborate theft. The county records showed that Henrik had died intestate and without heirs, making his property subject to seizure for unpaid taxes. But the documents I'd found proved that Henrik had paid his taxes through 1979, a full year after his supposed death, and had written a will that left everything to a nephew in Oregon, who'd never been contacted about his inheritance. The theft of Henrik's property had been accomplished through forged death certificates, manipulated court records, and the cooperation of officials who were either bought or threatened into compliance. Once the property was officially abandoned, Henrik's business partners had been free to remove anything that might have connected them to his evidence gathering. They'd searched the house thoroughly, judging by the scattered debris and damaged walls I'd noticed during my first walkthrough, but they'd never found Henrik's insurance policy. The documents I held in my shaking hands represented 47 years of buried truth, and Charlie and I had stumbled onto the key to a mystery that had consumed a good man's life. But Henrik had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. Every document in that strongbox was a copy, carefully prepared and preserved as backup evidence. The originals, according to a hand-drawn map tucked between photographs, were hidden somewhere else on the property. The map was drawn on heavy paper, in the same careful handwriting I'd seen in Henrik's ledger, with compass directions and measurements that suggested the precision of someone who'd spent time surveying his own land. Henrik's notations referred to landmarks that would have been familiar to him but meant nothing to me. The place where eagles rest, beneath the guardian oak, where the old fence meets the new stone. Charlie and I spent the next 3 weeks following that map, and my old dog proved himself worth his weight in gold. While I studied Henrik's careful notations and tried to decode his references, measuring distances and searching for the landmarks he'd described, Charlie simply used his nose and his instincts. He seemed to understand that we were looking for something important, and he approached the search with the same focused intensity he'd shown in the study. We walked every inch of those 43 acres, through brambles that caught our clothes and marshes that sucked at our boots, following deer paths and old property lines that hadn't been maintained in decades. The breakthrough came when Charlie led me to a massive oak tree at the property's northern edge, a giant that must have been growing when Henrik was a young man. The tree stood on a small rise that commanded a view of the entire property, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, and its branches spreading wide enough to shade a small house. This was clearly Henrik's guardian oak, and as I stood beneath its branches trying to interpret his cryptic directions, Charlie began digging at the base of the tree, with the same intense focus he'd shown in the study. But this wasn't random digging. He'd identified a specific spot where the earth seemed different, softer, as if it had been disturbed and replaced years earlier. When I brought a proper shovel from the barn and began digging where Charlie indicated, I found Henrik's true insurance policy, buried 18 inches down in a waterproof metal cylinder that had protected its contents through nearly 5 decades of weather and seasonal changes. The cylinder was perhaps 2 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, made of heavy-duty steel and sealed with gaskets that had kept moisture out completely. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth and sealed plastic, were Henrik's original photographs and documents, along with additional material that hadn't been in the strongbox. The cylinder contained Henrik's insurance policy, but it was more than just evidence. It was a complete confession, a detailed explanation of everything he'd discovered and everyone involved. Names, dates, amounts, bank account numbers, and a network of corruption that had its tentacles in the county courthouse, the state capital, and beyond. Henrik had documented not just the money laundering operation, but also the methods his partners used to eliminate threats, the officials they'd bought or intimidated into cooperation, and the systematic way they'd taken over legitimate businesses throughout the region. Some of the men Henrik had documented were dead now, but their sons and business partners weren't. The organization had evolved and adapted, but its core activities remained the same. As I read through Henrik's careful documentation by flashlight in my own kitchen that night, Charlie lying at my feet, with his head on his paws, I understood why Henrik had chosen to disappear rather than fight. These weren't people who negotiated or compromised. They were people who eliminated problems permanently, and Henrik had known that coming forward would mean not just his own death, but probably the deaths of anyone who tried to help him. So he'd chosen to hide his evidence and disappear, hoping that someday someone would find his documentation and have the resources to act on it that he'd lacked. But 47 years had changed the landscape considerably. The FBI had task forces now that specialized in cold cases involving organized crime, with resources and legal tools that hadn't existed in Henrik's time. When I called the regional office in Kansas City, the agent who took my call, a woman named Sarah Morrison, listened with the kind of attention that told me she'd been waiting for something exactly like this. Agent Morrison had been working organized crime cases for 15 years, and she recognized immediately that Henrik's evidence represented the kind of breakthrough that investigators dream about. Within 24 hours, she was sitting in my kitchen with 2 other agents, going through Henrik's documents with the reverence of archaeologists uncovering a lost civilization. The federal investigation that followed consumed the better part of 2 years and represented one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the region's history. Henrik's evidence led to indictments that reached from our little county courthouse all the way to Washington, D.C., to exposing a network of corruption that had operated for decades. Men who'd thought their father's secrets were safely buried found themselves facing federal charges for conspiracy, money laundering, racketeering, and in 3 cases, accessory to murder after the fact. The lumber mill that had been Henrik's legitimate business had changed hands several times since his disappearance, but the FBI was able to trace the money flows and establish connections that led all the way to the current day. The mansion that neighbors had called a foolish purchase became the center of the biggest corruption investigation in our state's history, its rooms filled with federal agents and forensic accountants who treated Henrik's documentation as the Rosetta Stone that finally allowed them to decode decades of criminal activity. Agent Morrison told me that Henrik's case became a model for other cold case investigations, demonstrating how one person's courage and careful preparation could eventually bring down an entire criminal organization. The evidence Henrik had gathered was so thorough and well-preserved that prosecutors were able to build cases that resulted in convictions even after nearly 5 decades had passed. But the real treasure wasn't in the headlines or the justice finally served, satisfying as those were. It was in the quiet moments when Charlie and I would sit on the mansion's restored front porch, watching the sun set over the 43 acres that Henrik Whitmore had died protecting. The house that everyone had mocked us for buying had given us something more valuable than money or vindication. It had given us purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes the crazy old fools are the only ones willing to listen when the dead try to speak. Henrik's nephew in Oregon, located through the FBI investigation, turned out to be a retired history professor who donated the property to the County Historical Society with the provision that it be maintained as a memorial to his uncle's courage. The restoration of the mansion became a community project that brought together volunteers who'd never known Henrik personally, but understood the importance of preserving his story. Local contractors donated materials and labor. Historical societies provided expertise on period-appropriate restoration techniques, and high school students researched Henrik's life for a documentary that would tell his story to future generations. Charlie became something of a celebrity during the restoration, with visitors making special trips just to meet the dog who'd found Henrik's evidence. He seemed to understand his role in the story, accepting attention with dignity while never straying far from my side. The transformation of the mansion took 3 years, but the change in the community happened much faster. People who'd lived with whispered stories about corruption and unexplained disappearances finally had answers to questions they'd carried for decades. Families who'd lost relatives under suspicious circumstances found closure when the FBI investigation revealed what had really happened to their loved ones. The county courthouse, purged of officials who'd been part of the conspiracy, began operating with a transparency that restored faith in local government. Charlie passed away last spring, but not before he saw the mansion restored to something approaching its original grandeur, and Henrik's name cleared in the county records. On his last good day, a warm afternoon in April when the oak trees were just beginning to bud, he walked with me to the guardian oak where we'd found Henrik's truth. His steps were slow and careful, but his eyes were still bright with intelligence and the satisfaction of a job well done. I swear he understood that our work was finished, that Henrik's story had finally been told, and justice had finally been served. He lay down in the shade of that massive oak tree and looked out over the property that had become his life's work, and I knew he was ready to rest. The locals don't call me crazy anymore. They nod when they see me at the hardware store and ask how the restoration is coming along. They bring their grandchildren to see the mansion and tell them Henrik's story, making sure that future generations understand the importance of courage and persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. But what they don't understand is that Charlie and I weren't just restoring a house or solving a mystery. We were restoring faith in the idea that truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried under decades of lies and fear. The mansion stands now as a testament to Henrik's courage and a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to look the other way when they encounter evil. The rooms that once held secrets now hold school groups learning about local history, researchers studying the techniques of historical preservation, and visitors who come to understand that heroism isn't always loud and public. Sometimes it's quiet and patient, hidden away for decades until the right person with the right companion comes along to bring it back to light. Have you ever trusted your instincts when everyone else called you foolish, only to discover that your gut knew something your mind couldn't explain? Have you found yourself in possession of knowledge that felt too big for one person to handle, but too important to ignore? Tell me about it, because I've learned that these stories need to be shared, and the courage to act on truth is something that grows stronger when it's acknowledged and celebrated.